China has emerged as one of the 21st century's most consequential nations, making it more important than ever to understand how the country is governed. Welcome to Pekingology, the podcast that unpacks China's evolving political system. I'm Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS, and this week I'm joined by Yeling Tan, Professor of Public Policy in the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Today, we'll be discussing her book, Disaggregating China Inc, State Strategies in the Liberal Economic Order. Yeling, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me here, Jude.
I'd like to start by asking you just a bit about your background and biography. I'm curious, how did you get interested in China? How did you get interested in studying China professionally? And then what set you on the course of your work that's really thinking about China's political economy?
Sure. So I am a native of Singapore. So grew up in Singapore before going off to the US to study. And I think probably growing up in Singapore in the 80s and 90s has had an impact on me in terms of living through a period of such rapid economic transformation that Singapore went through in those decades. And I think it was probably not until later, like teenage years, college years, that I started to sit back and think, well, is that exceptional? How did it happen? What does that mean in the context of the broader question of development? So in college, my original intellectual passion, and still is today, is this question of economic development and the political economy of it. Why do some countries go through the process of rapid change, sometimes a rapid crash? Why do some countries stay in a mode of stagnation? And what are the politics behind it? And my entry into becoming interested in China was really by accident. It was when I was a research fellow working in the National University of Singapore. My boss at that time wanted to do some projects on China, so we started reaching out to people in China and talking to people there. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear this, that, once you start trying to understand China and understanding what a fascinating place it is, it's very hard to move on to a different topic. It's unendingly fascinating. And so the questions that I started investigating when I first started studying China had to do with more change at the local level. And I found that really interesting because China is this one-party state and it's authoritarian and it's communist and Leninist in structure. So how does such a structure even manage to create space for local governments to tinker at the edges, to innovate around questions of public service delivery, transparency, and so on. So that was a book that came out a number of years ago with Brookings on China's local government experiments. And then I started looking more into China's efforts to build greater transparency into its policy making. And I spent my master's thesis working on that. So China's efforts to increase transparency in the environmental realm. And again, that was fascinating because it's such a contradiction, right? Why would an authoritarian government used to operating in secrecy, right? Used to operating with the idea that there is internal information that there is no need for society or the external world to know, why would it voluntarily look at ways to disclose information proactively or to institutionalize that? That seems to create a whole lot of tensions in the existing structures. And it's the same idea of institutional tensions or the potential collision of opposing forces that brought me to want to study China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Because here you have the WTO, which is this multilateral institution with these binding rules, with an enforcement mechanism in its dispute settlement body. And there you have China in the late 1990s as it was seeking to join the WTO. At that point in time, it was still incredibly heterogeneous, right? It was some private sectors, still a very large state-owned economy. Much of the planned economy was still in place, especially within the bureaucracy. And it had, up until that point, as much of the literature has showed, much of the process of economic growth and change up until the 1990s was about crossing the river by feeling for the stones, right? Incremental, experimental, no sort of set path. And yet it's trying to join this organization that's all about what's known as the single undertaking, right? You take on all of these rules that are by and large set by other parties as a whole in a single document. That to me creates incredible tensions, right? How would China's domestic system grapple with that? How would it digest these rules? How would it change the normal politics of its economic policy making? So that's kind of how I got into studying this topic.
And we're obviously going to spend most of this discussion delving into your views on WTO accession and the politics of it. But before we do, I wanted to ask you for a recommendation on a heuristic of sorts, or at least some mental tool that is helpful to you and might be helpful to others in making sense of, analyzing, parsing, disaggregating, summarizing China, infinitely complex place. And as much as it is important to accumulate individual facts about China, it's also how you make sense of those facts and patterns. So is there some mental tool or heuristic that is helpful to you that you might recommend to listeners?
Sure. So I think this comes from an article that was written by one of my advisors at Harvard, Tony Sage. And he wrote a piece called The Blind Man and the Elephant, right? And so I think that's it should be fairly well known to people what that means, right? So there are three men and they're all blindfolded. And there's an elephant in front of them. One of them walks up to the tail and says, "Oh, this is a rope." Right? One of them walks up to one of the legs of the elephant and say, "Oh, this is a tree trunk. I'm obviously, touching a tree trunk." And the other one goes up to the ear or something. I don't know what the third part of the elephant is, but you get the idea, right? Because China is large, and the sheer scale of China is incredibly difficult to wrap your mind around, right? What does it mean to run an organization such as the Communist Party that has over 90 million members, right? Which is larger than most countries. What does it mean to govern a country that has 1 billion people? It's very hard to comprehend, and it's very hard to maintain that comprehension while trying to dive into a very specific policy problem or a very specific puzzle. So by and large, we are all blind in the sense that we are all blinkered, right? You're trying to understand the nitty-gritty of industrial policy, and it's hard to do that while also realizing that this is an elephant that we're talking about. And so I tend to use that as a mental check to always say, well, okay, what is it that I'm not seeing? What is it that I might be missing? There was a paper I read once, and it was written by a couple of economists that took the unusual step of going to China to do some field work rather than just sitting at their desks and crunching the data like most economists do. And they came back from that. In the paper, they write about how they came back from their field work very frustrated because they found that, I think there's a loose quote from the paper, and every anecdote you hear about China, there is a counter and opposite anecdote, which is absolutely true because China is so large and so diverse.
I will say, though, which I totally agree with that, I feel like it has to be paired with not missing the forest for the trees. Because I guess now that I'm in sort of think tank world, one of the frustrations I sometimes have with academics, not you, but is there's such a focus on such a narrow part of it and such an unwillingness to come to larger conclusions that I feel like it can be at times almost quasi-nihilistic, because it's almost a little bit like, well, we can't know anything, and so qualified, and so China's not a monolith, which I agree with. It's totally 100% true. And I think your way of framing it as a check is important. But I also think sometimes we've got to you don't hear often anyone criticize anyone when they make a categorization about America by saying, well, America's not a monolith. So I totally agree with you, but I think those two work well together, of like blind man and the elephant and also forest for the trees.
I hear you. There we go. We can make a zoo.
Let's now get into the book. First, I want to say for listeners who are thinking that by listening to the podcast, they don't have to buy the book, that's probably true, but I will say you're missing a lot. Most importantly, I will say there's a handful of books that I have just found, although they're not pitched as this is how China's political system works, that's exactly what this book is to me. It's just a really fantastic description of how China's political system fits together or doesn't in many cases by using WTO accession and implementation as a vehicle. So I would say for folks who are just not even interested in the WTO, but for whatever area they focus on, need to know how China works or doesn't, I think Yeling's book is just a really fantastic, well-written, relatively short way to just have a much better understanding of how all the various political actors and bureaucratic actors and subnational and national, again, work together in a lot of ways, but also how they compete and vie and contest. So I want to just really recommend the book for that, even if folks are not particularly interested in the politics of WTO accession. But Yeling, maybe I can start by asking you, in the title of the book, it's Disaggregating China Inc. I think most folks have a sense of what China Inc. is, although we'll talk about that. Talk to us about why you put that word disaggregating and why that's such an important element of the discussion we're about to have on WTO.
Sure. So maybe we start with the China Inc. element of that, right? So as I was putting the book together and sending it off to the publisher, by that time, and it was very striking to me, there was a sort of a new conventional wisdom or commonly accepted narrative that had emerged about China and the WTO, which is that, firstly, the WTO failed to change China, secondly, that China all along had an alternative plan, which was to build a model of state capitalism, and then thirdly, to then export that state capitalism globally through SOEs and through things like the Belt and Road Initiative. So it was with this common narrative and conventional wisdom in mind that I started thinking about the title, because the common narrative is all about the China Inc., right? And my use of the term disaggregation is to challenge that conventional wisdom and to emphasize the importance of the domestic politics behind China's engagement with the global economy, right? When we say China, who are we talking about, right? Are we assuming that this is a very well-oiled machine that operates based on top-down direction? Xi Jinping says the word and everybody jumps into action and implements the directive smoothly? Or are the politics of it a little bit more complicated? If it's more complicated, then how are they complicated, right? Who are the main actors involved in China's economic policy making? So it's an effort to ask the audience to think a little bit about what makes up China Inc. and whether or not the incorporation, right, whether or not it's a well-oiled machine, or is there something deeper going on that's more political in nature?
Returning to our forest versus trees versus blind man and the elephant, one of the things that I thought was important and effective coming out of your book is problematizing some of the dichotomous categorizations we have to describe the behavior of the Chinese party state. So we do this in politics. It's either like Feng or Shou. It's reformists versus conservatives. And in this case, it's liberalization versus protectionism. You directly say this in the book for the sake of the audience. Why is that problematic in describing the behavior of again, in the aggregate, the Chinese party state in terms of its economic policy? And if you could answer that, maybe through your description of the various types of state strategies available and how those often aren't distinct paths, but in fact, oftentimes all these sorts of protectionist and liberalizing elements of policy can be existing in the same room, in the same industry, in the same locality.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's useful to dichotomize. It makes life easier for us. But in the process of doing research for this book, I found that the dichotomy liberalize versus protect, comply versus defy, basically was an inaccurate way of understanding what was going on within the bureaucracy and in terms of the lively internal debate going on within China over this very important question, right? How does the state govern the economy? And of course, we have to, as scholars, try to simplify, right? That's part of our job. We can't just describe every single thing that comes out as it's put forward. So where's the middle ground, right? So to me, it's important to think about there being, broadly speaking, three competing intellectual strands out there and policymaking strands out there within China when it comes to this question of what is the role of the state vis-a-vis the economy, right? So one strand of that, or one state strategy, if you want to call it that, one state strategy would be the directive strategy, right, which very much draws from China's experience with the planned economy, right, during the Maoist period, where the role of the state is to allocate resources. So if you have a microwave industry, then a directive strategy would be to say, by the year 2028, we need to have a production capacity of 4 million units of microwaves per year. Right, these kinds of targets you still see coming out in many Chinese economic policies. But competing against that is what we might think of as a more developmental strategy, where the role of the state vis-a-vis the market is to shape firm incentives, right? To draw firms towards one sector versus another, rather than just saying produce X number of microwaves, right? Maybe create a tax incentive or other types of mechanisms to draw firms towards the microwave sector and help them become successful in producing microwaves. And this very much draws from the experiences of Japan and Korea and other types of developmental states that we can think about. And then the third approach, competing against the directive strategy, this developmental strategy, would be a regulatory strategy, where the role of the state vis-a-vis the economy is to play the role of referee, right? To try to enhance market functions. Right. So here the role of the state would be to set rules, set clear standards, be sort of a traffic cop, right? Saying you obey these rules and then the market outcome is the result of firms competing within these rules, right? So you set standards to enhance interoperability. What's interesting about economic policy making in China is that over this course of experimental and incrementalist reform, from the 1980s onwards, space was created for each type of governance strategy to emerge and take hold within different parts of the economy. Because China's planned economy was never removed wholesale, right? China never engaged in shock therapy. It meant that as reform progressed, as more space came out for private sector approaches, for developmental approaches, for this kind of regulatory approach, the planned economy never went away. Agencies that had absorbed the lessons and mentalities and approaches of the planned economy, right, like the State Planning Commission, never went away. And so what we end up with is a situation where the intellectual debate and the policy debate within the Chinese government becomes more conflicted over time, even as we see China's economy take off. So at any given point in time, you can see a locality reaching for these different tools and these different ways of issuing policies, depending on which agency is in charge, right? And this applies to the central government as well, right? If you're looking at the Trade Ministry, the Ministry of Commerce, you'll see that many of its policies are geared towards compliance and being consistent with international rules. If you look at the industrial policy agencies like the National Development and Reform Commission, you'll see them reaching for guidance tools that are much more reflective of their history of having evolved from the Planning Commission. And then there are shades in between as well. There are agencies that look to successful examples of Japan and Korea and say, well, look, we can combine market incentives with an active role of the state.
Does this still feel like the way to think about the toolkit in the Xi Jinping era, one where there's very, as Barry Naughton calls it, sort of grand steerage of there are these key sectors that we know we want to dominate. So yes, there's still market activity, but very much with an intentionality of where we want this to go. Does it feel like that's eroding the really fascinating narrative you just laid out in terms of the traditional ways that China has approached this? Or does this still feel like it's broadly consistent in the Xi Jinping era from previous eras?
To me, I still see a lot of that bureaucratic contestation happening, in part because different agencies will continue to compete for influence even under this age of of grand steerage, right? As Barry Naughton has very helpfully phrased. Yes, there's greater efforts to offer very, very high level guidance, but the guidance being high level continues to allow space for these individual agencies to try to flesh out what it means to be a competitive industry. So I think you'll see, I mean, if you look at the electric vehicle sector, for example, right, why has it been successful? My hunch is that if you talk to different bureaucrats in different parts of the government, they will give you different answers for why China's EV is so successful. Right, your industrial policy agencies might say, well, it's because we are able to provide the right types of incentives and guidance to these industries. But other agencies or other officials that are more market oriented might say, well, it's because there's intense and almost vicious competition domestically within these private firms that force them to be able to succeed. And they would say that without the market incentive, without that competitive stage, China's EV sector would never have become as successful and as world beating as it is today. And then other officials might say, well, it's because the government forcibly instituted a plan to build charging stations, which is a fairly brute force way of creating economic change or industrial transformation.
Maybe we can return to this at the end of the conversation, but I want to now have both of us get in a time machine, and I want to go back to the 1990s, because to talk about China and the WTO today, we need to go back to the 1990s when the discussion first began in China and in the United States and other developed economy capitals about the possibility of China coming into the WTO. So just at a high level, let me just first ask you the question of why did China want to join the WTO? And I guess maybe a more accurate way to ask that, given what we're about to talk about in terms of varying bureaucratic responses to this, is not China, but rather who in China wanted to join the WTO?
Sure. So this is a very long and actually very, very fascinating and very relevant history for people to understand. So China applied to rejoin the GATT because the WTO did not exist yet in the 1980s. China applied to rejoin the GATT in 1986.
General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs.
Yes. And it wasn't until 2001 that it succeeded in joining what had then become the World Trade Organization, which was created in 1995. So it was a 15-year process, an incredibly long and difficult journey that was interrupted by various events, right? Including Tiananmen Square in 1989, including the bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, and so on. So it was by no means a foregone conclusion that China would succeed in joining the WTO. It was quite the difficult journey and a really fascinating set of events for me to learn about in the course of researching this book. So why did China want to do this? I think various reasons. At the very high level, sort of foreign policy level, I think there was a sense of China's becoming a real trade powerhouse, and it should take its rightful place in the world's leading multilateral trade organization. So if you want to be super high level, you can think about it making sense that way. There was a desire for China to join tracks, as it were, with the rest of the world. But there was also a domestic policy impetus by people such as Zhu Rongji, the premier of that during the 1990s, which was to use these external rules of the WTO to force through what would be very difficult domestic reforms that were stuck up to that point in time. And it's a fairly well-known strategy, and it's not uniquely Chinese as well. Other governments do this also.
This is where we can really get into the core thesis, which is, so you have a certain group of leaders in China who have a vision for where they want China to go. They also see the WTO as a forcing function. That's a group of the leadership. Getting to the disaggregation, let's now talk about reactions across the Chinese political bureaucratic system. So if we're putting two categories, the supporters and the opposition, building on your answer just now, what were the types of government bureaucratic actors, and if you could give us names, who saw this as advantageous, and why were they in support of WTO accession?
Sure. So if we think about the groups of people within the Chinese system who were supportive, it's a fairly narrow group. We have the leadership. So Jiang Zemin was broadly supportive as well. Zhu Rongji was the real architect. And the agency most associated with him during this time was the state SETC, the State Economic and Trade Commission, the MOFTEC, the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Economic Cooperation would have been supportive as well. But then you had the broad swathe of the rest of the central bureaucracy who were by and large opposed to this prospect of joining the WTO or joining GATT for various reasons, right? So back in the 1990s, many ministries were still very closely associated with the specific industry that they governed. And for them, they saw WTO entry as mainly a threat, right? First of all, an economic threat, because WTO entry by and large meant China unilaterally lowering its tariffs to allow foreign imports into its domestic economy. And there was a broad fear that this would result in domestic industries in China being crushed by foreign competition, right? By cheaper and more competitive goods on the economic side. On the bureaucratic side, you also had these ministries that were very used to operating with a broad amount of discretion, not used to and resistant to the idea of suddenly having their actions being scrutinized by external parties, being scrutinized by foreign governments, and being scrutinized by this international body sitting in Geneva. The agricultural sector was also incredibly nervous about cheap imports coming in from the rest of the world. And in the early years, there was so much bureaucratic opposition to China liberalizing its tariffs and lowering its tariffs that negotiations really went nowhere. And scholars such as Margaret Pearson have written in detail about this. Joseph Fewsmith has written about this as well in great detail. And it wasn't until the central government decided to reduce the amount of participation in the negotiations. So basically, they centralized and made the negotiations less participatory. It was only then that they were able to make more leeway. And that's also not uniquely Chinese as well. If you look at how other governments negotiate their trade agreements, a lot of it happens in secrecy because there's so many different sectors involved that if you just open it up and have it fully transparent, the amount of opposition can very easily just grind everything to a halt.
It's a time-honored strategy for running meetings anywhere, is you don't invite the people who are going to slow you down.
There you go. And so this was a politically risky thing for China's leadership to do because there would eventually be blowback, right? So when Zhu Rongji went to the US in 1999, he went with the hope of being able to seal the agreement with the US on China's WTO accession, which would then open the gateway for eventual agreement with the other major economies and then finally joining the WTO. It was a failed mission. And when he returned to China, the concessions that Zhu Rongji offered to the US were leaked, right? And because the internal negotiation had been fairly centralized, the broader swathe of China's bureaucracy got to see for the first time what the Chinese government was willing to give up in return for WTO membership. And this led to immense blowback, right, against Zhu Rongji and against the chief negotiator, Long Yongtu as well, right? They were branded as traitors. They were branded as having sold out the country. And even after China finally succeeded in joining the WTO, because of the nature of its protocol of accession, China signed on to what are known as WTO plus commitments, so going above and beyond the commitments of existing members. It also signed on to some WTO minus commitments, meaning that it was given treatment that led to weaker rights compared to other existing members. Right, the nature of its protocol of accession led critics, right, those who were unsupportive of WTO accession, led critics to say that this was yet another unequal treaty that China had signed on to, and that the country had been sold out by these traders. So it was a very politically risky move for these reformers, and they had very narrow support within the bureaucracy when they finally pulled the deal through.
Let's now fast forward. And again, we're having to skip over an amazing amount of really fascinating analysis, both in the book and as it occurred in China. But I wanted to now get to the post WTO period. So I think you've done a really great job of explaining the complexities and various bureaucratic interests and incentives to WTO accession. Obviously, the consensus view now is that WTO succession did not result in the outcome we were hoping from. And indeed, this is not just a Western story. There are many in the Chinese political system who are disappointed with the trajectory that China's taken. And these voices have been around for a very long time. They were around in the 2000s, warning about the trajectory that China was heading. But let's get to that. I mean, one of the interesting things is we tend to think that the shift towards a much more statist approach is either a Xi Jinping phenomenon or, as they called it at the time, guojin min tui, so the state advances, the private sector retreats, is a post-2008 global financial crisis story. So those are sort of the two most commonly held demarcation moments. You pull it back a little bit earlier. And I wonder if you can talk about why the mid-2000s now seems to be the point at which we begin to see China's political economy move in this, I don't know what the right word is, whether it's statist, whether it's more steerage, but talk a little bit about why it happened a bit earlier than most of us commonly think of.
Sure. So the way I came upon this realization that this shift was a little bit earlier than your most common explanations, right? Financial crisis or Xi Jinping. The way I came about this was basically from gathering the data, looking at the impact of China's accession. So on the one hand, gathering a lot of industrial policies to track the changing nature of Chinese economic policies over time. And when you look at these policies, you see that the surge in policy activism really starts around 2005, 2006, with the NDRC becoming much more active in particular. And then if you track business sentiment over time as well, what you see is, and here I'm relying on data from the American Chamber of Commerce, right? They survey their firms based in China every year. And when China joined the WTO, they asked their firms the same question over a series of years, which is, to what extent do you think the business environment has improved? You see strong optimism in the initial WTO years because indeed the central government engaged in a sweeping overhaul, right? Institutionally getting its national rules and regulations consistent with international trade law, international standards, giving the private sector the right to trade for the first time, abolishing the dual trading regime, launching a campaign for WTO awareness. So all of the positive energy in terms of institutional reform fed into a fairly, I would say, optimistic set of business sentiments amongst American firms. But you see this change, and it changes a couple of years even before the financial crisis even comes along. You see this change around 2005, 2006. The share of firms, American firms based in China that are optimistic or feeling positive about the business environment falls to a minority rather than being a majority. So the question is, what changed? And why, right? So it wasn't necessarily the financial crisis. I don't think the financial crisis had nothing to do with all of the industrial policies that came after, but I think what the financial crisis did was to enable the deepening of a set of forces that were already at play, starting from '05 and '06 onwards. And I think a lot of it is associated with the 5-year plan that was issued in 2006 and the push towards indigenous innovation. But then again, why this shift, right? Why this change in 2006? And the way I look at it is really the interplay of international and domestic factors, right? So as I mentioned earlier, the reformers or reformist factions or reformist agencies within China have always played or occupied a fairly marginalized and rather vulnerable role in Chinese politics, right? They've always had to fight against a fairly powerful set of conservative agencies or conservative politicians. And one of the main reasons or key drivers for WTO entry from Zhu Rongji's perspective was to use these international rules as leverage, right? And the degree to which the leverage was useful extended also to domestic agencies that were of the more reformist bent. Because they were relatively weak and more politically marginalized, it advanced their influence and it helped them to be able to point to international rules to say, look, right, if we don't change these policies, we're in violation of the WTO. Or to say, look, right, if you reform China's domestic institutions and if you allow for greater capacity in international law within China, it helps China because it helps China to be able to fight these same cases as an equal player in the international arena. So it was useful to officials within the Commerce Ministry to be able to point to WTO commitments to get their work done. The problem is that the protocol of accession was sort of a time-limited, time-bound agreement. There were a number of commitments that were supposed to be implemented within a set timeline. And within a few years, many of these commitments were by and large done. And there wasn't a new set of commitments that came around. So the force of these external commitments faded over time. Layered upon that, you had a change in leadership. And in particular, you had a change in premier, right? So Zhu Rongji was no longer there and he was replaced by Wen Jiabao. And the two were fairly different premiers in terms of their relationship with the central bureaucracy. Right, when I think of Zhu Rongji, I think of him with this stern look on his face, wagging his finger and kind of scolding the central bureaucracy for being so lax. And he was the discipliner in chief. I mean, in 1998, he halved the size of the central government in a massive bureaucratic restructuring. He's the architect of the 抓大放小 policy, right? Driving the corporatization of state assets.
Just for the sake of listeners, 抓大 means so centralize a few big SOEs and then sort of privatize the rest, right?
Yeah, so any of the SOEs that are too small, uncompetitive, loss-making, right, either merge them or privatize them or push them into bankruptcy. Any SOEs that have the potential to be strong, right, build them up. And this led to massive dislocation within the Chinese economy and millions of SOE workers being laid off, right? So he pushed through SOE reform. He halved the size of the central government and he pushed China into the WTO. He was the discipliner in chief. When you come to Wen Jiabao, I don't think that his ideas or his preferences were necessarily more statist, but he, to me, had a different relationship with the central bureaucracy, right? If you look at his career, apart from a number of years spent in Gansu province, he spent many years of his career kind of rising up through the central bureaucracy and in the central party state. And he got to the premiership, I think, at a stage where, in a sense, you can think of his relationship with the central bureaucracy as being, in a sense, mutually dependent. So whereas Zhu Rongji was the one who disciplined the central state, Wen Jiabao, to me, relied on the central bureaucracy to get things done. Right. So it's during his premiership that you see the emergence of NDRC as really a mini state council, right? And the emergence of MIIT, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, as yet another super ministry. This is the age where the central government expands rather than shrinks. And it empowered, at a time when the leverage for these reformist agencies was weakening, it empowered the industrial policy agencies, right? Many of these agencies were never supportive of WTO entry in the first place. And now the political environment had shifted such that they could really flex their muscles. And that's why you see the shift happening even before the financial crisis comes along.
I guess final question is something of a counterfactual, or I guess if we still have the time machine, given subsequent events, if you could talk to U.S. trade negotiators, Bill Clinton himself, and members of Congress, would you, knowing what you know now, advise against bringing China into the WTO? So I guess that's a yes or no question. Or is it yes, but this is what we would need to do to ensure that the non-compliance didn't metastasize in the way it did? And this is obviously a live discussion now with conversations over China's PNTR, permanent normal trade relations status. And I think the conclusion is, it was from many, right, is that it was a mistake to bring China into the WTO. What I think is so good about your work is it's easy now to say we shouldn't have brought them in. If you were in USTR, if you were in Congress, if you were in the Clinton administration in 1994, 1995, the fact that arch conservatives in the Chinese Communist Party are worried that the WTO accession is going to liberalize China. The intellectual debate in China, liberals and conservatives both had high expectations or adverse expectations about what the WTO would do. So that history is important. It doesn't obviate the important question of, should we have brought them in? And if we did, what should we have done differently?
So I think this is a really important question. So maybe I'll take a bit of time to unpack my answer because I have a lot of thoughts about this. The short answer is yes, right? So yes, but then what else needed to be done? And I think we can split this into done where, right? The first piece of this is what needed to be done domestically with regards to policies within the United States. I want to focus on this first because the narrative that's out there is that letting China into the WTO hollowed out American manufacturing, right? And this narrative is based on a set of studies by Order Dawn and Hansen, the China shock literature. But I think perhaps the conclusions drawn from this specific study have missed a few steps along the way. So if we think about trade and your trade 101, right? Economists, political scientists, scholars have known for a very long time that trade is dislocative, right? Trade creates winners and losers. You learn that as an undergrad. So it shouldn't be surprising that trade created winners and losers in the United States economy, in the Chinese economy, and in any other country that engages in trade. The question then is what one as a government does with the losers from trade, right? Those who lose their jobs as a result of trade liberalization. And I think where the trade economics literature became less useful for policymakers was that there was an assumption that you can take the gains from trade, redistribute, or retrain, and all will be well. And I think when it comes to the import story, right, what the China shock literature tells us that something was missing, right? That redistribution didn't happen. And it led to not just job loss, but also political polarization and a set of very negative social outcomes in America's manufacturing heartland. However, that's a story that only analyzed imports, right? And completely excludes the export story. So if you bring Xiangjin Wei at Columbia, his study into conversation with the Order Dawn and Hansen study, right? You see that American exports benefited greatly from China being in the WTO, and that meant benefits to different segments of the American economy, firms, consumers, and so on. Because the narrative now is that China's entry into the WTO hollowed out American manufacturing, right? The conclusion seems to have skipped to, well, therefore, we should stop trading with China or we should securitize our economy against China. To me, that misses a step, and it misses a crucial question of how one engages in trade, right? I mean, good trade policy is about building out a good set of domestic policies to cushion the negative impacts of trade. Why is it that some countries are able to trade with China without having this same kind of very negative China shock happening and others don't, right? There is a missing piece there, which is a question of your welfare state, your social policy, your social insurance, your education policy, training, and so on. And here I think the narrative has skipped over this question of what would progressive trade policy look like for America, right? What would a trade policy for America that builds jobs, that is able to cushion the negative impacts of trade, what does that look like? Instead, we've just jumped towards let's embed our economic policy within the security purpose, which is let's secure ourselves against the China threat. So I think that's really unfortunate. Now, we think about what then should have been done at the same time.
Can I intervene on that, though?
Go ahead.
With 1,000% violent agreement that our trade policy should have been better and different, especially insofar as we're building out also a better safety net to compensate quote unquote losers of trade, and also giving them the skills and training to be able to compete in industries of the future. And maybe this is what you're just about to get to, but you still have the question of, and I'm very much influenced by Mark Wu's China Inc. challenge to the WTO. That's the sort of mental architecture in my head. And it's still like the question is, yes, but should we have brought in an authoritarian political system with a set of institutions and understandings that in so many ways violate both the spirit and the letter and just even the conceptual architecture of the WTO? I mean, that's Mark's, one of his key points is just if you can't make any coherent distinction between state and private actors, if you have like boundary blurring institutions like the Communist Party, which are embedded all throughout, I mean, it's every company with more than 3 party members has a party cell in it. Now, most of those party cells don't mean diddly squat until they suddenly do. So just at a conceptual level, even if we had the best trade policy in the world, we would still have China under an authoritarian political system with this party state apparatus. What do you think about that?
Absolutely. So I really like Mark Wu's article, and I think it very clearly lays out the ways in which the specific issue areas in which the WTO can manage issues related to China's system and the areas in which it just is not set up to deal with, right? Because the various alternative economic models that decision makers had in their minds when they designed the WTO did not include a system as unique as China's. Neither did it really take into account the sheer size of China's economy. So here, I think we have to think about problems that are China specific and problems that are WTO specific, right? And avoid misdiagnosing the problem as entirely about China. So if we think about the structure of decision making in the WTO, it requires consensus. That's incredibly hard to get to, right? That's why these trade rounds last forever and never conclude. Layered upon that, you have a trade agenda that, because it was so successful in previous rounds, increasingly started to touch on issues that go beyond just liberalization at the border to concern policies that are very much behind the border, right? That deal with issues that many governments would think are part of their sovereign domain, right? When it comes to intellectual property or your domestic investment policies or industrial policies or legal structure. And that makes it harder and harder to get to consensus. So if we look at WTO as an institution, right, it's become much less adaptable to the point that the Doha round has failed to deliver. So why did the Doha round fail? In part, it was not so much about China becoming very successful. China was part of the story here, but the Doha dilemma was equally about Brazil, India, South Africa banding together to demand a trade round that delivers for developing countries, right? That legitimately is about development. This is supposed to be the Doha development round. And they were unable to reach an agreement with the EU and the United States, right? So can the WTO deliver on a development agenda was as much a part of the picture here, right? The failure of the Doha development round meant that there wasn't a new round of liberalization that all countries agreed to. And that fed into the weakening of the leverage within China as well. There was no new round of commitments. And China, in a sense, was still adjusting to the previous round. So it also played a part in not wanting to have too much liberalization too fast, right? So China was part of the picture. But the problems with the WTO today are as much about structure and the demands of developing countries as they are about China. It's quite multifaceted. And I think it's a misdiagnosis to say that China came in and just destroyed the WTO and therefore we should just give up the whole game, right? If we look at the counterfactual of if China had not joined the WTO, what would that China look like today, right? So which aspects of Chinese society and politics do we see the most freedom to discuss and debate? To me, that's economics, right? Which department in any given university has the most internationalized curriculum? It's probably law and economics, because when it comes to WTO entry, right, trade is highly legalized. So alongside this economic liberalization came the necessity to build up state capacity, legal capacity to engage in trade law. So Greg Schaefer has a great book that talks about transnational legal ordering that goes into detail about the degree to which WTO entry really transformed the legal landscape in China. And you have now, today in China, a generation of lawyers, right, who are well versed in international law, who are able to speak with their counterparts in the same language and able to not just push China to be compliant with their existing treaty obligations, but also to fight for China's interests at the international stage, right? This would be absent or much weaker if China had not joined the WTO, right? China would be this pariah in the international trade law system. And then entire cohort of lawyers that are trained in administrative law and so on. So I think it's easy to underestimate the amount of effort that China put in to join the WTO, and it's easy to underestimate the amount of change that did happen because of everything else that also happened at the same time. But I think we do need to be level-headed and serious in our counterfactual thinking, right, to consider this very important question that you're raising.
By the way, in the basket of heuristics, I think counterfactual thinking is insufficiently appreciated. Even where there's disagreement, I think going back and thinking of if we shouldn't have done X with China because of where we are today, I think that is an important discussion. Equally important is just thinking through, well, if we had gone back and not done X with China, what would China's development trajectory have looked like? And would that have worked in our interest or not? And unfortunately, there's usually not neat answers on all these. There's varying shades of gray. So appreciate your thoughts there. Really appreciate this discussion. And again, just can't recommend the book enough, not only for folks who are interested in thinking about the future of the WTO, the future of economic integration with China, but really for armchair students who want to understand how policy is made in China and what it looks like in the messy world of policy contestation.
So I failed to answer one piece of your question there, which was about PNTR. If you allow me a quick interjection just to address that, because it's in the ether today, right? So what would happen if you revoke PNTR, right? So China would stay in the WTO, but the US would basically claim the right to completely change the tariff schedule against Chinese imports, right? Either raising them unilaterally across the board or even holding specific line items in the entire schedule hostage in negotiations. So this is incredibly costly, right? It's incredibly costly domestically, and it's costly with America's allies and partners, and it's costly to the multilateral trading system, right? It's costly to the US economy and workers because inputs will be costlier for American firms. That's going to erode their competitiveness on world markets. Those who can't compete with these higher costs will be forced out. So that's going to generate unemployment. Goods will be more expensive for American consumers. That's going to hurt the lower income groups more disproportionately because they spend more of their income on basic goods, on laptops for high school students, for college students. And this is out factoring China's retaliation into account, right? Once China retaliates against the raising of tariffs, right, the economic impact will only deepen. And that's just domestically within the American economy, right? It's going to be costly to America's approach of bringing allies and partners together and bending allies and partners together to tackle the China challenge. Because if you raise these tariffs to, in a very crude way, cut off US demand, that will drive down prices on global markets, right? Where are these exports going to go to if they don't go into the American market? They'll find alternative markets. Right. And so your allies and partners will suddenly find that they're having to deal with a surge of imports that are coming to their ports because they're not going into American ports. Right. How do you then get these allies and partners to still cooperate with you on the swathe of policies that you need international cooperation on? And then if you think about the WTO and the multilateral trading system, it's yet another blow to a multilateral trading system that the rest of the world wants and the rest of the world is willing to invest in. And they're finding themselves needing to kind of cobble together these ad hoc coalitions in the absence of the United States, right? That used to be the leader, that used to be the main actor investing in it. What are the incentives for the rest of the world to play by the rules if we have the hegemon just throwing it into the fire and saying, forget it, right? So we need to also think about how such a move would impact public support for trade in other countries, right? So David Steinberg and I did a bunch of surveys of the Chinese public during the trade war in the Trump years, right? And we found that not only did the trade war and the tariffs erode Chinese public support for trade, it eroded Chinese public support for trade as a general concept, right? We thought most of it would be reciprocal, that because of this tit for tat logic, right, the Chinese public would reduce their support for trade with the US. We found that this was the case, but not only did they not support trade with the US as a result of the trade war, their attitudes towards trade in general were weakened as well. And that totally makes sense, because if you have the hegemon suddenly withdrawing support from the trading system and saying, we're not going to play by the rules anymore, what are the incentives for the rest of the world? If we look at elite sentiment in Southeast Asia, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore regularly surveys elites in Southeast Asia. And they ask these elites about their perceptions of leadership on things like international trade. Over the past couple of years, right, Southeast Asian elites' perception of US leadership has fallen on the trade question. Alongside that, their perceptions of China's leadership on trade issues has also fallen, right? So it's really not a zero-sum game. It's just, if China goes down, the US doesn't go up, right? Both countries can go down together. So I think we really need to be careful when we talk about doing something like revoking PNTR, right? The domestic costs to your allies and partners, cost to multilateral trading system, and cost to support for trade in general in these overseas publics.
Yeah, I think this is a really important discussion. I think you made some really great points. I think part of it is the two sides of the debate are to some extent talking past each other in the sense of there's different motivations, I think, on different sides of this issue. I think one issue is a little bit less worried about efficiency lost and actually is looking to drive a degree of decoupling out of concerns over the costs of integration. This is one where we need some more overt, direct policy debate out in the public sphere on this, because I agree, wherever you come down on this, would be a momentous decision made. And I tend to lean in your direction, but I think this is one we just need much more open debate. Let me just reiterate what I said in your pre-PNTR answer, which is, again, just how helpful and important I find your insights and thinking on this and how much I enjoyed the book and learned from the book. So, yeah, I really appreciate your time today. Appreciate everything that you've written and how clearly and persuasively you write it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jude. I really enjoyed our conversation.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts, from Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog